Hector Monsegur, alias Cebu, flipped and helped put Davis and the others away. After he began working undercover for the FBI in return for a radically reduced sentence, Monsegur encouraged hackers to disrupt more targets, and he repeatedly reached out to Assange and Jake, which suggests both were under U.S. investigation. The FBI was not the only agency to infiltrate Anonymous. Taking advantage of its loose structure, ordinary criminals used a group protest of Sony Corporation policies to break in and steal credit card numbers. Russia also had a substantial presence in Anonymous. In retrospect, it is interesting that some Anonymous members would later go on Moscow's payroll. One of them, Cassandra Fairbanks, moved from real-world Anonymous demonstrations to attending and writing about Black Lives Matter protests, to avidly supporting Bernie Sanders in the 2016 primaries. With more than 100,000 Twitter followers, she then took a job at the Russian propaganda outlet Sputnik and switched to full-throated support for Trump through the 2016 general election and afterward. Just before the November vote, she appeared on Alex Jones's YouTube conspiracy channel saying it was pretty likely that emails hacked from Hillary Clinton campaign chair John Podesta's Gmail account contained coded references to pedophilia. Monsegur liked to talk about his political work. He told journalists that he had hacked for a cause long before, protesting U.S. Navy test bombing in Puerto Rico, where his family had lived. He also claimed to have defaced Chinese websites in 2001, as other Hacktivism supporters did. Monsegur said he joined Anonymous as it fought PayPal and Visa and moved up from the cacophony of the main internet relay chat channel to more elite planning channels, including the one that morphed into LulzSec. The most impressive story. As part of Anonymous's Operation Tunisia, during the Arab Spring democratic uprisings, he personally defaced the web page of the country's prime minister, who had approved mass hacking of citizens. But that and the other relatively high-minded feats proved impossible to confirm. Arthur Olson described the Tunisian defacement as Monsegur's work, citing him as the only source. Professor Gabriella Coleman, who was perceived as sympathetic, obtained chat logs and said Monsegur did not lead the team that performed the Tunisian defacing. In any case, even Monsegur's few remaining supporters would have to agree. He was an inveterate liar. His more prosaic crimes, such as stealing car parts and credit card numbers, were no mystery at all. Another core LulzSec member, 16-year-old Mustafa Tiflo al-Bassam, an Iraqi refugee in London, did something more challenging than defacing a website. With help from a local Tunisian who got trick phishing emails from the government, al-Bassam hacked into the server sending the emails and modified the malicious program they carried, quietly rendering it impotent. Like Monsegur's, Assange's judgment was soon called into doubt. Wanted for questioning in a Swedish probe of sexual misconduct, Assange lost a bid to avoid extradition and jumped bail in 2012, fleeing into Ecuador's embassy in London and remaining there. After Assange railed against his Swedish accusers from hiding, some of those inside CDC who had reserved judgment about him moved into the opposition. But as that furor grew and WikiLeaks increasingly focused on exposing U.S. secrets, Jake stayed the course. That loyalty built his stature as an information security rock star for those who remained believers in Assange. Within CDC, however, he caused more friction. Laird wrote to the private CDC email list that he was concerned about the departures of other WikiLeaks stalwarts fed up with Assange's dictatorial ways and grandstanding. That meant that the group depended on one man who was showing himself to be less and less dependable. I had heard that Assange had problems with women months before any of the Swedish thing became public. Laird wrote, "Does Assange tone down his profile until the rape cloud is lifted? Hell no. He can't be in front of the press enough. So if he's convicted of some sort of sexual misdemeanor, this will, in my opinion, completely torpedo WikiLeaks." Jake came up firing, defending Assange as a visionary and dismissing the female complainants as fame-seeking. WikiLeaks' flagging reputation was one reason Edward Snowden did not turn to it with his documents in 2013, though Assange did later dispatch a colleague to spirit him from Hong Kong to Moscow and asylum. Inspired by John Perry Barlow's Independence Declaration, Snowden wore an Electronic Frontier Foundation sweatshirt on the job at the NSA. When he felt compelled to warn the world about what his agency had been doing, Snowden first reached out anonymously to a new EFF spin-off called the Freedom of the Press Foundation, which had been formed in support of WikiLeaks by Barlow, Pentagon Papers leaker Daniel Ellsberg, Boing Boing's Jenny Jardin, and a few EFF staffers. One of the staffers recommended Snowden get in touch with Freedom of the Press Foundation director Laura Poitras, who had been making a movie about WikiLeaks, and former Salon columnist Glenn Greenwald at the UK's Guardian. The Guardian published many of the most important revelations from Snowden's trove, but the pair also collaborated with other publications, including The Washington Post and The New York Times, to write up Snowden's disclosures. Jake later reported related stories for Der Spiegel in Germany, going further in exposing specific U.S. capabilities instead of broad practices. Though it was widely assumed the documents referred to in the stories came from Snowden, the information they contained has not been cited by The Guardian, New York Times, or Washington Post, which all had access to the main Snowden archives. That suggests a few possibilities. Der Spiegel may have had a different standard about what to publish. The material may have come from a second, still unknown source, or it may even have been obtained through hacks by the Russian government, which then leaked to Der Spiegel. Snowden showed how closely the U.S. government worked with and through American technology companies, sucking up domestic calling records, sifting through emails for specified content, and examining communications in other countries, which are not protected by the Constitution's prohibition on unreasonable searches and seizures. Google, for one, had not realized that the NSA was breaking into its properties overseas, and it moved swiftly to encrypt internal transfers of user data. Other stories showed that the NSA had continued to corrupt security products by paying for backdoors to be implanted, or by promoting standards that it knew it could break, such as the dual elliptic curve pseudo-random number generator. No major reforms passed Congress, and the anger in other countries hastened the balkanization of the Internet and sped up the introduction of nationalist technology policies that hurt U.S. providers to the detriment of populations everywhere. At the same time, the revelations intensified work on more secure alternatives. One of the most promising was Signal, developed by a team led by the brilliant anarchist and ex-hobo known as Moxie Marlinspike, and released in 2014. The Snowden disclosures carried enough force that Signal's end-to-end protocol became mainstream, even without most of its users' knowledge. The two founders of WhatsApp, an enormously popular messaging app for smartphones, were Jan Koum and Brian Acton. They sold the company to Facebook in early 2014 for $19 billion and stayed to run it with some independence. Koum belonged to the long-running hacking group WooWoo, which included CDC's Adam O'Donnell and such CDC friends as Doug Song. Song urged Koum to get in touch with Marlinspike, and Koum agreed when Acton proposed having WhatsApp adopt the nonprofit Signal's open-source technology, protecting 1 billion people from mass surveillance. In 2018, Acton would donate $50 million to create a new foundation to spread Signal much further and sign on as executive chairman, citing the opportunity to make a meaningful contribution to society by building sustainable technology that respects users and does not rely on the commoditization of personal data. Later, he said he had been motivated by an increase in requests from law enforcement and the desire to render those requests useless. Koum stayed on at Facebook, where he was one of only 3 executives also serving on the company's board. Though he continued to run WhatsApp, Facebook began demanding more data than expected about WhatsApp users, building up ad revenue, but also exposing the users to greater corporate and government scrutiny. Koum would quit in mid-2018. Jake moved to Germany in 2012 and spent more time promoting Tor than he did coding for it. He attached his name to security research on other issues that drew wide attention. But some co-authors later complained that he had asked to be added so that he could use his fame to promote the work. Jake flouted his edginess in multiple ways, including boasting of his past work for San Francisco bondage porn site Kink.com and sexually propositioning people at first meeting, even in professional contexts. He bragged of multiple lovers and had relationships with filmmaker Laura Poitras, who later acknowledged that he had mistreated a friend of hers, as well as Boing Boing's Jenny Jardin, a friend to several in CDC. Jake spoke of waking up in bed with Assange and 2 women, and he attended private sex parties, less rare in hacker culture than elsewhere. Even there, he pushed past the norms of the environment. One of his techniques in pursuing sex from someone who might otherwise object was to begin transgressive behavior in front of another senior hacker, said longtime friend Andy Isaacson. That hacker, not wanting to burn a relationship, would not object. This in turn put more pressure on the prey, who was more likely to assume that Jake was following norms in the situation, or would have a witness on his side if not. Jake's magnificent gifts overlap with the same fundamentals as his failure. He's very intelligent and he doesn't let things go, said Isaacson. A key lesson from the experience, he said, is that abusers can use loose organizations as hunting grounds. As a champion social engineer, Jake exploited his role as a gateway to hacker prominence, victims said, leading many to conclude they would be frozen out if they objected. He targeted more junior people in the Tor community, where complaints led to a 10-day suspension for suspected harassment in the spring of 2015. That did not dissuade him. Fortunately, longtime EFF head Shari Steele took over as Tor executive director later that year, bringing more responsive leadership. Steele came too late for some, including a young engineer named Chelsea Comlow, who had gravitated toward security after hearing Jake speak at her company about Snowden's leaks. Comlow traveled to Hamburg for the Chaos Computer Congress in December 2015 and went to Berlin with others after to socialize. At Jake's apartment the night of January 1st, she blacked out and woke to realize Jake was having sex with her without consent. Earlier, she had refused his repeated requests to have sex in front of and with others, but both of those things occurred. Back home and upset, she confided in people who knew other victims, and she got in touch with them. Steele's arrival at Tor gave them hope that change was possible. To protect themselves and warn others, they went to Steele and also prepared a website where they told their stories of assault and coercion under pseudonyms. For me, it was really important that new people entering the community not have what happened to me happen to them, Comlow said. Jake resigned on Thursday, June 2, 2016, but Tor gave no reason in its announcement. Only after the anonymous website went live the next day did Steele acknowledge on Saturday that concrete sexual assault allegations and an investigation were behind Jake's departure. At various times over the next year and a half, some victims identified themselves, including Comlow and Lee Honeywell, a Canadian security engineer for big tech companies. Honeywell said that during an on-and-off consensual relationship a decade earlier, Jake had ignored a safe word and become violent. Being involved with him was a steady stream of humiliations, small and large. Honeywell wrote on her own site, "He mistreated me in front of others and overshared about our intimate interactions with friends who were often also professional colleagues." Without criminal charges, Jake fought back, in part through media connections who cast doubt on some of the anecdotes. He denied the worst accusations, threatened legal action against the women, and implied that the attacks against him stemmed from his work for free speech and secure technology. Still more people came forward, and the weight of evidence against him grew. Tor handled it in a way that you would hope and expect, Comlow said. Comlow was invited to a Tor conference the next year. began writing code for the project, and later was designated a core contributor. That was especially encouraging, Comlo said, because of the male dominance in the field, and because women are more likely to be abused by men who spy on them. Security and privacy is a great field for women because there is a lot of moral reasoning, and you are in it because you want to protect people, and that should be something that resonates with not just straight white men. The Tor project replaced its entire board. Even Jake's mentor, Roger Dingledine and Nick Mathewson, stepped down while remaining lead employees. People involved in the process said that the prior regime had had a leadership vacuum and consistently played down what many people told them about Jake. What you tolerate and don't tolerate defines you, one of them said. New directors included the EFF's Cindy Cohn, cryptography experts Bruce Schneier and Matt Blaze, and Gabriella Coleman, the anthropologist who chronicled Anonymous. After a few days, Barlow's Freedom of the Press Foundation, which by now had added Snowden to its board, dropped Jake as an unpaid advisor. Noisebridge, a warehouse-sized San Francisco hackerspace Jake had co-founded, said he could not come back. Jake's early defenders included some Tor node operators, EFF co-founder John Gilmore and Daniel J. Bernstein, an anti-government cryptographer who had helped loosen export rules with Cohn's legal help years before. Most cautioned against rushing to judgment without legal process. Now a professor in the Netherlands and a major figure in spreading non-NSA-backed encryption, Bernstein kept Jake on as a graduate student. The revelations were especially painful for CDC, which had built Jake's credibility with other hackers. His conduct underscored the male domination in security generally and in the hacker social scene in particular. Worst, Jake embodied the dark side of CDC's formula, wielding a media-savvy, boundary-flaunting personality that could drive awareness while also feeding a rapacious ego. What had made CDC special was shared values despite different viewpoints in areas of expertise, and that had been shattered. Those of us who knew Julian back in the day always knew he was kind of a shit. I personally was always dubious of WikiLeaks largely because of that, Paul Leonard said. The reasoning all goes back to the core of CDC, and furthermore, was why Jake Applebaum hit us in an unreasonably painful way, which is that to an extent, CDC functioned as something akin to a family unit. CDC could have said nothing. It was not as famous as it had been a decade earlier, and many of the articles about Jake wouldn't mention his affiliation with it. To the group's credit, its far-flung members scrambled even before the anonymous website appeared or Tor elaborated on its one-sentence announcement of Jake's resignation. Jake was still on the CDC mailing list, so the discussions had to happen elsewhere, including in smaller email chains. Luke alerted Kevin and Laird to early references on Twitter about rape accusations. Christian Ryu also wrote to Misha Kubeka. The concern was followed by caution. It's bad news, but I would definitely want to see more evidence than just some random dudes on Twitter before we took any action internally. Luke wrote, Misha spoke from the gut. Fuck, what is up with WikiLeaks people and rape? After Christian spotted the anonymous accuser's website and passed along the link, Laird weighed in Saturday morning, saying that he had known that women had been trying to gather evidence of rape against Jake, and that he had heard some unsavory stories of sexual conquests. He can be a complete dick, Laird wrote. I have my own experiences with this when I hosted him in India and he pulled some dumb stunts. Luke added Adam O'Donnell to the thread and suggested they seek out Jake's side of the mess. The news story started showing up on Sunday, and a friend of the group, Nick Farr, wrote publicly about being threatened by Jake and his supporters. That happened after Farr obliged Jake's demand that he cancel a 5-minute talk during the Chaos Computer Congress's open mic session by someone claiming that Jake was a U.S. intelligence plant. Farr refused to hand his correspondence with the would-be speaker over to Jake. Every night I came back to my hotel room, a typewritten note on my pillow stating, "Don't make us use extreme measures," handed all over. Farr said he contacted people he thought he could trust to explain what he was doing, but they all told him to find a compromise. You can't dialogue with a sociopath, Farr wrote. What's worse is when people you consider your trusted friends take the sociopath's side. That was enough to push Laird toward making a public statement, and Adams seconded. Without having heard back from Kevin, Luke asked Misha to remove Jake from the mailing list so that they could out a proposed decision and statement to the full group. Finally, late Sunday night, Kevin showed up and said he wanted to quietly remove every trace of Jake from CDC sites, including the alumni roster. "I'm very sorry for my part in accepting this guy. That was dumb," Kevin wrote. "What I've come to realize is that personality matters 100% more than skills for this stuff. Whether any of these allegations are true or not, he doesn't fit in with us." The group convinced Kevin that they needed a public distancing. They collaborated on what would be its most serious public statement in more than a decade, then posted it to the CDC homepage and to the then open CDC Facebook group, where many of the members and fans shared information. Like much of the hacker community, we were troubled to hear the allegations of sexual abuse, manipulation, and bullying leveled against one of our members, Jacob Applebaum, a.k.a. I.O. Error, it began. "We're also aware that the Tor Project is conducting an internal investigation and encourage anyone with relevant testimony to come forward. For some, it won't be easy. There can be shaming or humiliation, or the fear of not being believed. It is also our responsibility to create an environment where people feel safe to come forward. We have always stood for freedom of speech and expression, which sometimes necessitates the right to anonymity. This is something that victims of abuse often require. We stand by their right to be anonymous. Others, like our friend Nick Farr, who decided to go public with his own difficulties, deserve our respect and support. Everyone will do this in their own way. We know that it may be scary, but we also encourage victims to contact their appropriate local authorities. We understand the complicated relationship we all have with law enforcement, but there is a time and place for government intervention. If the most extreme of these allegations are true, they should be addressed in a court of law and dealt with appropriately. Cult of the Dead Cow is known for a lot of things, but treating people horribly is not one of them. If communities are to thrive and remain relevant, we have to do some house cleaning from time to time. As we have become aware of the anonymous accusations of sexual assault, as well as the stories told by individuals we know and trust, we've decided to remove Jake from the herd, effective immediately. In a personal post on Medium, Laird said he hoped the ouster would help educate others about systemic sexism and hackerdom, exacerbated by a tendency toward rule-breaking, distrust of legal authorities and reporting transgressions, and some excessive scenesterism. There's been a lot of looking the other way in the hacker community when powerful people overstep the bounds, and that has to stop. It didn't take long for that wish to start coming true. As the broader anti-harassment movement known as #MeToo built up steam in the fall of 2017, the hacker community rose up against other accused predators. Even Cap'n Crunch, John Draper, who had haunted hacker cons from the days of HoHoCon, was finally outed for pursuing underage boys and banned from gatherings. A Draper spokeswoman denied his seeking sex. At least Jake was gone from CDC before the election of 2016, when his association with WikiLeaks would have been indefensible to everyone in CDC. WikiLeaks would be a central partisan player in helping elect Trump, who lavishly praised it on the campaign trail. Emails stolen from the Democratic National Committee by Russian operatives were gleefully published by WikiLeaks as the Democratic Convention was getting underway, when they could be dumped with maximum impact. Hours after Trump's campaign was blown off course by the publication of a video in which he bragged of grabbing women by the pussy, WikiLeaks muddied the day by beginning to roll out stolen emails from Clinton campaign chairman Podesta. Long-promised leaks about Russia, meanwhile, never materialized, and Assange repeatedly tried to throw off suspicions with misinformation. denying that Russia was a source and hinting that a DNC staffer was one. In the summer of 2018, the special counsel's indictment of 12 Russian military intelligence officers would quote the emails between WikiLeaks and its real source, a Russian-created persona calling itself Guccifer II. Jake and Assange were far from alone in draping themselves in morality while serving other causes. Instead, they were just the most prominent exemplars. From 2016 on, a substantial amount of purported hacktivism would be something else in disguise. Chapter 11. Mixter, Munch, and Phineas. While Jake Applebaum provided one example of the cult of the dead cow's negative influence, he was not the only one. Edward Snowden had pulled back the veil and showed the symbiosis between Western intelligence agencies and big technology companies. CDC blood had infused both sides of that relationship, and both had lost moral luster. But soon, CDC's descendants would be playing on all sides of an increasing complex struggle among spies in many countries, their technology suppliers, and the enemies of those suppliers, both those opposed for moral reasons, like the Citizen Lab, and those opposed for geopolitical reasons. Then, too, there would be anonymous vigilantes with motives hard to discern. For the most part, they remained hidden, protected either by the technological sophistication of the very best hackers or by the tools provided by a nation-state. The root cause of all this mess was the deeper integration of the nearly indefensible Internet into all major economies during the tech industry's amoral drift of the 2000s. As that happened, it was inevitable that big governments would use security weaknesses to their advantage. It did not have to follow that they would ignore basic defense research, but they did that too. So what CDC had called out as a looming disaster at the turn of the millennium, shoddy software, uneducated buyers, and disengaged officials, had gotten much worse over the next decade. Instead of acting perhaps in concert to improve the security of what was driving economic growth for everyone, governments were supporting a dark market for knowledge about specific software flaws and techniques for exploiting them in order to spy. For some governments, the top targets were human rights advocates, journalists, and minority party politicians. The people Laird Brown and his ilk had set out to protect were now in a much worse position than a decade before. When I was young, there was something fun about the insecurity of the Internet, complained signal inventor Moxie Marlinspike. It opened up possibilities for anyone inventive enough to take advantage, despite their underdog status. Now Internet insecurity is used by people I don't like against people I do. The government against the people. Of course, many of those who ended up supplying tools to the wrong people began with good intentions, including an early supporter of Laird's Hacktivismo project named Martin Munch. As German hacker Kamal Ackman, called Mixter, was writing the 6.4 proxy system for Laird, the latter-day CDC member had landed a job at a Munich startup called Cipher Labs, which was trying to develop an encrypted email system. Kamal helped get Laird a job there as well, and he looked for colleagues at the company who might volunteer for Hacktivismo. Kamal thought he'd found a perfect candidate in Munch, an intense and brilliant teenager. Kamal added him to the Hacktivismo mailing list, which had about 20 steady contributors and 10 times as many quiet readers who lurked and learned. Kamal also introduced the young man to others he knew in the Berlin scene, centering around the Chaos Computer Club. Martin was an idealist, Kamal said. He had my full trust. But Munch wanted to be a rock star, and that also influenced his trajectory. Munch told Kamal that he wanted to help the police catch the worst of the worst, the makers of child pornography, and he left Cipher to go work on software that he said would help. Because he had recruited and mentored Munch and introduced him to human rights-oriented hackers around Berlin, Kamal felt guilty for what happened next. I put Martin on there. I am partly responsible for his career, Kamal said. I personally found him a bit strange. Laird said he still regards Munch as a friend, One who lost control of a project due to a struggle inside the company he started, not because he had chosen an immoral path. Whatever the reason, Munch's system became the next flashpoint in the fight over hacking, security, and privacy. As with WikiLeaks, the debate would go beyond professionals and engage the media and general public in a discussion about the balance of power between governments and average citizens. Though hunting from behind blinds, Russia had been driving a significant chunk of that debate, probably with Munch, and definitely with the dumping of hacking tools used by the National Security Agency. While CDC had started blending political motives and security work with the Hong Kong blondes, 2 decades of increasing geopolitical influence on hacktivist causes since then have made it hard to tease apart the real actors and purpose behind many public hacks. Munch's modest program developed into spyware called FinFisher or FinSpy. In Kamal's thinking, Back Orifice 2000 inspired the project, and Munch might have adapted some code from that open-source effort. But Christian Ryu was aiming only at Windows computers. Munch's FinFisher targeted Windows and Apple computers, Android and Apple phones, other devices, and most operating systems. There were other differences too. Anybody could use Back Orifice 2000, but those users needed to find a working exploit, or a gullible victim, to get it installed. The company selling Munch's FinFisher, called Gamma Group, also provided the tricks to get it installed on the devices. Munch headed product development in Gamma's Munich office. Gamma also had a headquarters in the UK and affiliated companies in Singapore and other countries, which ostensibly sold only to established government agencies. Kamal heard about Munch's connection to Gamma in 2008. In 2011, activists infiltrated the trade shows known as the Wiretappers' Ball and emerged with a 60-page Gamma catalog. FinFisher is the cutting-edge, offensive IT intrusion portfolio on the market today, it declared. The portfolio included impressive spy programs aimed at smartphones. Those were very hard to detect, could be operated remotely, and would not only capture voice calls and electronic contact lists, but also turn the phones into constant surveillance recorders. USB thumb drives and phones with spy programs that were very hard to detect could be operated remotely and would not only capture voice calls and electronic contact lists, but turn phones into surveillance recorders. The same year, during the Arab Spring, Egyptian rebels discovered a similar pitch was given to the brutal State Security Investigation Service. Gamma said that the deal hadn't gone through, that it complied with export laws, and that it only sold to governments targeting criminals. But activists suspected repressive regimes, including those under widespread sanctions like Sudan, were using FinFisher against law-abiding dissidents. In 2012, Bloomberg News obtained suspected infected emails sent to Bahraini activists and handed them off to the Laird-inspired Citizen Lab. A Citizen Lab team led by a Google security expert dove deep. For the first time, they established that the infections were connected to Gamma, how the infections worked, and that data from the victims would be sent to the Bahraini government's telecommunications company. Citizen Lab found FinFisher servers in dozens of countries, including the UAE, Ethiopia, and Vietnam, where bloggers were being targeted. Technological tricks used by the company included intervening in software update processes and using exploits for Adobe's Flash video software. 2 years later, someone hacked Gamma badly. The hacker opened a parody Twitter account at Gamma Group PR and tweeted links to stolen files with source code, client lists, and other damaging information, including a chart showing that the largest number of visitors to the company's customer support pages had shifted from the Netherlands, France, and China in 2009 to China and the U.S. in 2014. The tech press had a field day. Activist researchers rejoiced, and nonprofits filed complaints with authorities that severely hurt the company. In 2015, @Gamma Group PR came back to life to announce that it had also hacked Gamma's best-known rival, Italian company hacking team. As Lulzsec had with H.B. Gary Federal's Aaron Barr, the hackers delighted in pointing out the company's poor security. Once more, they dumped source code, client lists that showed apparent sanctions violations, and embarrassing emails. Hacking team tools had been used against Ethiopian journalists and other innocents, including some inside the U.S. The person controlling the @Gamma Group PR account, who referred to himself as Phineas Fisher, said in a later interview with Vice that he had gone after both companies out of moral outrage. I just read the Citizen Lab reports on Finn Fisher and Hacking Team and thought, that's fucked up. And I hacked them, he explained. Hopefully, it can at least set them back a bit and give some breathing room to the people being targeted with their software. In that interview conducted over electronic chat in July 2016, Phineas used informal English and alluded to the anti-sec movement from years earlier. Describing himself as an anarchist revolutionary, Phineas published tutorials and a manifesto encouraging others to hack their oppressors. In another interview a month earlier, Phineas admitted to hacking a Catalan police union in the Spanish region that includes Barcelona and posting the home addresses of more than 5,000 officers. He called it a small strike against power and denied being Spanish or speaking either Spanish or Catalan. All the same, that very local target fueled speculation that Phineas was a politically minded hacker from the region. Phineas's stunts took the original anti-sec movement and H.B. Gary breach in exactly the direction that previous hacktivists who were willing to break the law would have gone. He used his knowledge of how the world really works to make it harder for technology to be applied for oppression. After Phineas came leaks of purloined material from Cellebrite, an Israeli tech forensics company that breaks into phones for law enforcement, and from the makers of FlexiSpy, spyware used by parents to track children and by romantic partners to snoop on each other. Cellebrite had been reported by some publications as the company that helped the FBI finally break into the Apple iPhone of a terrorist who killed public employees in San Bernardino, California, after Apple refused to do it. The FlexiSpy hackers paid tribute to Phineas and published an updated security and how to hack guide for fans. If you're a hacker, hack back, they wrote. If you're an ordinary person, stay safe. Watch how things progress and see what people are saying about how to detect FlexiSpy and protect yourselves. If you're a spouseware vendor, we're coming for you. Stop. Rethink your life. Kill your company and be a better person. Otherwise, you'll be seeing us soon. Gabriella Coleman, the anonymous chronicler teaching at McGill University, called the trend the birth of public interest hacking. And it is likely that at least some of what grew to more than a half dozen spyware breaches stemmed from moral objections to the vendor's conduct. All the same, it is worth taking another look at instigator Phineas in the wake of the hack of the Democratic National Committee and publication of NSA tools. The basics of the DNC breach and others against Democratic Party officials during the 2016 U.S. elections have been clearly established by U.S. investigators, including those working for Special Counsel Robert Mueller. One DNC breach came shortly after the publication of a Pulitzer-winning series of articles about the leaked Panama Papers, which showed that Putin's friends were stashing billions of dollars overseas. Putin blamed Clinton for the underlying leak of an offshore law firm's files. Given that U.S. intelligence had indeed debated exposing Putin's corruption, he may have been right that it was a CIA operation. Though Assange tried to cast doubts about who provided WikiLeaks with stolen emails, Russian intelligence clearly drove the attack on the DNC and related hacks. The persona Guccifer 2, which shopped some stolen DNC data while claiming to be Romanian, once forgot to use a virtual private network to connect and revealed his true location at the GRU, Russia's military intelligence service. Russia also arranged for the publication of emails and other documents by WikiLeaks and others. The major NSA breach has not been tied up as neatly. In August 2016, just weeks after Phineas stopped bragging, a group calling itself the Shadow Brokers appeared on Twitter and began dropping not only vulnerabilities in Microsoft's Windows, Cisco routers, and other programs, but also working exploits, all of which had been held by the NSA. Most of the information came from late 2013, after Edward Snowden had left the agency, meaning that there was another mole, or a hack of agency hardware, or a careless employee who had been hacked. Shadow brokers kept going for months. Some of the tricks it disclosed were then used by others, including the presumed North Korean distributors of badly crafted ransomware called WannaCry, which shuttered hospitals and other facilities around the planet in 2017. Eventually, 2 NSA employees were charged with bringing classified files home. At least one of them had been running Kaspersky antivirus on his personal computer. That was cause for special concern, because the Israelis had broken into Kaspersky's networks in 2015. Inside, they had seen that the software was used to search for classified U.S. documents, and they had warned the Americans. The consensus in the intelligence agencies was that the Russians had obtained at least some of the shadow brokers' information in that manner. The disclosures badly hurt Kaspersky, which had enjoyed a remarkable run, publicly exposing high-end U.S. malware, starting with the Stuxnet virus, which had knocked out Iranian nuclear centrifuges. Kaspersky admitted it had taken some secret files from a U.S. government employee, though it claimed that it had deleted them. The U.S. banned it from federal government use. The Russians had the motive to steal U.S. hacking tools, the means to do it, and the opportunity. Russia was also one of the few suspects with so many of its own tools that it could afford to dump those of the U.S. instead of hoarding them for its own use. The timing is particularly interesting, since the NSA dumps began in August 2016, 2 months after the DNC breach was disclosed. Russia created chaos and distraction inside the agencies best able to find the source of the DNC hack and strike back, helping to paralyze the Obama administration and mute its response. With that history in mind, it is worth revisiting the identity of Phineas Fisher. Missing from virtually all of the mainstream media coverage was the fact that Gamma Group and Hacking Team generally did not sell to Russia or its closest allies. They sold hacking tools to the West, and Phineas stole them and dumped them in public, just as the shadow brokers would do starting weeks later with the NSA. In addition, Gamma Group held special interest for Kaspersky. 2 former Kaspersky employees told me that the company had lifted inactive code from a Gamma computer after someone there foolishly installed their antivirus software. And then there are the matters of Phineas's choice of other targets and what we now know to be Russia's strategy of sowing division in the European Union, in the U.S., and in other strategic countries. An attack on the Catalan police union would fit with pitting regions against the central Spanish government, which emerged as a Russian goal in 2017 when the Catalan government defied a Madrid court order and held a referendum on seceding. After Spain ordered the Catalan leader removed, the loyalty of the police was of enormous importance. It would be surprising for a highly skilled, willfully law-breaking and morally driven hacker to take down both Gamma Group and Hacking Team and still get seriously involved with Spanish political issues. At a minimum, you would expect someone with that combination to be Spanish. But that is not all Phineas did. He also hacked the data of innocent Turkish citizens during a period of confrontation between Russia and Turkey and made that data public. Though this context was missing from most of the hack's coverage, Russia and Turkey had been in an escalating confrontation since Turkey had shot down a Russian plane, killing its pilot in late 2015. Over the next half year, Putin increased pressure on Turkish President Recep Erdogan with sanctions on Turkish food imports and a ban on sales of Turkish tourist packages to Russians. At the same time, Erdogan was losing popularity in the West as he cracked down on the media and activists. Meanwhile, Russia and Turkey were pursuing different goals in neighboring Syria, Russia's client state. Erdogan had to choose between Washington and Moscow, and he eventually opted for the latter. Even though the downed plane was believed to have been in Turkish airspace, Erdogan folded and wrote to Putin in June 2016, "I once again express my sympathy and profound condolences to the family of the Russian pilot who was killed, and I apologize to them." Erdogan had planned to purge the military, and that triggered a coup attempt in July 2016. It emerged later. Russia was the first outside nation to condemn the coup, suggesting that the alliance had been firmed up beforehand. But many pieces were in play at once, and it would make sense for Russia to have been interested in weakening Erdogan's hand by exposing his party's followers to scrutiny in the same way that exposing the Catalan police officers' personal information could have been useful in stirring the pot. Perhaps Russia was betting on both sides of the Erdogan military conflict, so that whoever emerged victorious would be in its debt. In any case, it would make more sense for Russia to publish such information than it would for a politically minded hacker in Spain or elsewhere. Phineas's explanation for what he was trying to do and what went wrong, on the other hand, makes little sense. "I hacked AKP, the ruling party in Turkey, because I support the society Kurdish people are trying to build in Rojava and Bakur, and they're being attacked by Turkey," Phineas posted in July. He then added a complex story for why sensitive information was published about ordinary people. According to Phineas, he had hacked into the party servers and shared a historical file of emails with people in the rest of regions, asking them what he should do with the access. The emails themselves were not interesting. They included people asking for potholes to be fixed or for help finding work. There was nothing from Erdogan or his inner circle. Then there was a miscommunication between some of them, Phineas wrote, and one of the people gave the dump to WikiLeaks. He said that even though the person who had relayed the files realized the mistake and asked WikiLeaks not to publish, it did so anyway. But Phineas then published more files himself, including a database of ordinary AKP members and, worse, a database of almost all the adult women in Turkey, along with cell phone numbers and addresses for many of them. Those databases were copied and reposted by people like UK security activist Thomas White, who tweeted as @CthulhuSec, and had won a measure of controversial fame by posting the fruits of many large hacks. WikiLeaks tweeted links to those databases, which allowed millions of women to be reached by stalkers, further angering previous admirers of Phineas, such as Electronic Frontier Foundation activist Eva Galperin. "Who's that behind the not-so-great leak of Turkish emails?" Galperin wrote on Twitter. "It's at Gamma Group PR, whose previous work I have enjoyed." 3 months later, White stopped posting links to leaked data, complaining that the motives of the hackers had gotten more crass. 3 months after that, Phineas told Vice he was retiring his moniker and that he would take a break from all hacking. So now we have a hacker who is extraordinarily skilled, ethically driven, and broad enough in his thinking to go after both the rank-and-file regional police in Barcelona and the Turkish ruling party, yet sloppy enough to expose the phone numbers of millions of women in a patriarchal society to the general public, along with those of ordinary party members, just as they become uniquely at risk if exposed. It seems unlikely. Even without the relationship with WikiLeaks, an equally logical explanation would be that Phineas is a Russian intelligence project. Indeed, that was Washington's private conclusion. Within U.S. intelligence, it's generally assumed to be Russians, said Jim Lewis, a well-connected longtime senior State Department official and negotiator on global Internet issues. It's consistent with Russian activities in other areas. If the Russians did try to ruin Gamma Group and hacking team, they had their own tools for spying on citizens and enemies and were merely making life harder for governments in the West. That doesn't necessarily mean that those companies didn't deserve exposure. Kamal, for one, didn't hesitate before applauding the leak. even if it came from the Kremlin and hurt his old friend Munch. "I'm really happy about it," he said of the exposed gamma tools. "They should be leaked, and they should be burned." Even if Phineas isn't Russian, a look at the bigger picture is warranted. We have to accept that hacktivism is often polluted by geopolitics, as in fact it was with Laird, and that such influence can be impossible to detect. If that weren't alarming enough, there is a deeper realization. The great powers of the world contest each other in public and in secret, using arms and money, diplomacy and spying, false activism, and public relations. At the same time, most governments have similar interests against their own people. None of them want their citizens to be able to communicate in secret, not even the United States. In 2018, the FBI was still railing against the ability of people to use encryption that vendors cannot break, and congressional allies were still threatening legislation to outlaw such security. Kamal saw the trend toward greater government power against the individual as so dispiriting that in 2011, he left the security industry for years. Like others in CDC, he felt the best remaining hope for preserving individual freedoms lay with the biggest vendors, like Apple and Google, who could in theory play the major governments off one another and protect users in the process, and with private startups like Signal that feel they are chasing things more important than money. Apple was clearly a battlefront. It was home to at-stake veterans Window Snyder, David Litchfield, and Rob Beck, along with many more CDC kindred spirits. Some of them helped stave off the FBI's attempt to force it to crack the San Bernardino iPhone. Apple argued that the government could probably find a way to break the phone on its own, and that making it write a new program would be compelled speech, which has been found unconstitutional. The FBI was losing when it suddenly found an unnamed contractor with a 0 day that could do the job and drop the case. Google was another war zone stocked with CDC members and admirers. It had realized the NSA was the enemy after Snowden documents showed the agency had been breaking into its networks overseas where it did not need court approval. Google moved to encrypt far more deeply, even if it maintained the ability to recover all users' emails. The two companies also fought against proposed government-mandated backdoors and bans on end-to-end encryption, which by 2018 were popping up around the globe. There was still fighting to be done inside the big companies, but leading lights in the encryption fight were also spending more time helping the startups. Others were beginning to think more about the meaning of free speech when the immediate problem in many countries was not the inability to speak, but the propensity to get drowned out by manufactured voices directed by governments and big economic forces. Laird and the others in CDC were appalled at the likes of Gamma Group and sorry to have played any role in Munch's rise. But while they may have cheered Phineas on, they were not interested in breaking the laws themselves. As the hacktivist battlegrounds evolved toward hacking, leaking, and information warfare, they had to find other ways to help. After Laird returned from India to Germany, he went back to work for the former CEO of Cypher, the now failed encrypted email provider that had also employed Kamal and Munch. The ex-CEO Erikos Pitsos had an idea for a platform for serious debate he called Kialo. The software guided discussion by showing decision trees that listed which followers had agreed with which points. Moderators rejected unhelpful comments. Pitsos funded the project himself, aiming to create a collaborative reasoning tool, and Harvard and other universities tried out private versions for classrooms. It wasn't going to get rid of the bots and trolls on Twitter, but at least it was positive. On the side, Laird began writing a book on information warfare. Some sympathetic to U.S. cyber operations, including Mudge, also saw a clear ethical case for authorized offensive work. They decided that hacking in order to spy, to prepare the battlefield in case of further conflict, and to conduct highly targeted destructive attacks, as with Stuxnet, was vastly preferable to sending in bombs and troops. Others in CDC, looking at the mixed motives as geopolitical priorities ascended, opted to go back to basics on defense. By making the internet safer for everyone, they could chip away at the unfair advantage the net had been giving to attackers since the beginning. Chapter 12. Mudge and Dildog. Peter Zatko, known to even close friends as Mudge, was not the most engaged executive at Stake, even though he was the lead creator of the Pioneer Hacker Consulting Group. The most famous member of the cult of the dead cow was elsewhere much of the time, fighting his own demons and, after 9/11, America's demons as well. What he saw made him very afraid. Mudge knew as much as anyone about the basic failings of tech security and about their root causes. The Internet's inventors built it on trust, and it got loose in its test version, before Vince Cerf and his team could come up with reliable security. It still ran that way. All software has bugs, some of which can be exploited. Layering software on software makes it less secure. The software vendors had all escaped legal liability for poor craftsmanship and had little incentive to devote significant resources to making their products safer. This hard line on liability has only begun to fray in 2018 in extreme cases, as with deaths blamed on automated vehicles programming. Regulation ranged from non-existent in most commercial markets to negligible in industries such as financial services, healthcare, and power distribution, all of which meant everything was unsafe and would only get less safe as the economy grew more dependent on technology. This was classic market failure, compounded by political failure. One could debate the largest causes of the political failure.